At a Massachusetts state trial in September 1967, Joe Barboza, testifying on behalf of the U.S. government, fingered Salvati and 3 other men for a murder they did not commit. He did so with the acquiescence of many people in the criminal justice system, including field agents, prosecutors, and supervisors, all the way up to J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, who signed off on the framing of Joe Salvati. These men were more concerned with protecting the informant status of Barboza, who was being used as a federal witness against the mafia in New England, than they were in safeguarding the civil liberties of 4 nobodies whom they knew were being wrongfully convicted. All these years later, the web of duplicity that led to Joe Salvati serving 30 years in a maximum security prison for a crime he didn't commit is still difficult to fathom. But it happened. Joe Salvati knows it happened, because he had to live it. At the time, he said, it was the nightmare that wouldn't end. Salvati speaks with a gravelly voice from another era, something out of the 1950s or 1960s when he went away to prison. In fact, he sounds exactly like what he is, a street guy who was locked away decades ago and then abruptly released into the modern world with little preparation. During the early weeks of the Bulger trial, the story of Joe Salvati's ordeal hung over the proceedings like a veil of smoke that lingers long after a conflagration has been brought under control. The grounds upon which the prosecutors objected each time Salvati's name was mentioned usually had something to do with relevance. The prosecutors wanted to establish that the story of Salvati being framed by Barboza and many co-conspirators in the criminal justice system had no business being discussed at the trial of Whitey Bulger. It was ancient history, they contended, an admittedly shameful episode in the annals of justice in New England that had been rectified many years ago. The prosecutors wanted it to appear as if what happened to Joe Salvati had nothing to do with Whitey Bulger. Salvati had been victimized by Barboza and Barboza's handlers in the U.S. government. Afterward, some of Barboza's handlers in the FBI would go on to become the handlers of Whitey Bulger, who, like the animal, was protected by the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in New England. As a confidential informant, or CI, Bulger was the government's supposed secret weapon in the war against the mafia, just as Barboza had been for a previous generation of agents and prosecutors. To allow the story of Joe Salvati to be told in court at the Bulger trial would directly link successive generations of corruption spanning half a century. It would suggest that perhaps the entire criminal justice system was a grand illusion, a shell game presided over by petty bureaucrats more concerned with promoting their careers and protecting their own asses than anything else. It would suggest that maybe the story of Whitey Bulger wasn't really even about Whitey Bulger. Maybe it was more about the venal system of justice that had created Whitey, given him his power, and made it possible for Bulger to wreak havoc in Boston for 20 years. I asked Joe, "How many reporters have come to interview you since Bulger was pinched?" "Not many," he answered. "How many since the trial got underway?" "None." Apparently, the local media didn't want to hear from Joe Salvati either. Anything that Joe might have to say was a distraction from the main event, which had to do with burning Whitey Bulger at the stake. To ask questions about how Bulger came into being, to explore the historical antecedents that made Bulger possible, was considered to be doing the work of the defense lawyers. To the U.S. government and the media, it was all about Whitey, not about the universe that created Whitey. At the trial of Whitey Bulger, there was no room for the big picture. There was no room for the story of Joe Salvati and how his ordeal, which began in 1967, had planted the seed for all that came later. I asked Salvati, "What do you remember about the day you were arrested? Anything?" He said, "I remember everything from the day I was arrested till the day I come home." I was skeptical. 30 years is a long time.